You've worked so hard on your garden and now it's finally time to harvest. I'm going to share a few tips to ensure that you're harvesting at the right time for the best flavor for your crops. We'll also talk about the best time to harvest more than 30 of your favorite fruits and vegetables so your harvest doesn't go to waste. The first tip is to harvest first thing in the morning. The plant's flavor is typically best when you can harvest first thing in the morning rather than after the long day when the plant's had a chance to lose more moisture throughout the day. The flavor is going to be the best if you can harvest first thing in the morning. The next tip is to harvest often. Look around your garden and don't wait to harvest. Make sure that you're picking early and often. This typically helps plants know that they need to produce more. When you leave your garden harvest on the plant, it signals to the plant that they can slow down and not produce anymore. So you want to make sure that you're picking and enjoying those garden harvests. Once you've harvested that produce, handle it carefully. Those fruits and vegetables often bruise easily, and you want to take care of that produce and use it as soon as possible. Keep it out of direct sunlight and bring it indoors, and use or store it as soon as possible to preserve that garden flavor. Certain vegetables have different times that they are best harvested at, and I'm going to share a few tips to know when to harvest different vegetables. Let's talk about tomatoes. You have a couple of different options. If pests and birds aren't a problem in your garden, you can leave them on the vine until they're at peak ripeness. That means they're full colored and firm, but will yield slightly when you press on them. If you're like me and the birds tend to find your ripe tomatoes, or you're worried about frost, you can also pick tomatoes at the breaker stage. The breaker stage is when the fruit has about 30 to 40% of its color. Bring it indoors and let it continue to ripen. I like to put my tomatoes top down in a basket on the counter. Begin harvesting basil when the leaves are about 3 to 6 inches long. Picking encourages more growth. Harvest by picking a few leaves from each plant instead of all the leaves from one plant. When flowers appear, pinch off the top 2 or 3 sets of leaves to remove the flowers. Basil is best eaten right after harvest. Snap beans are ready to pick when they're about as thick as a pencil and before the pods fill out. Harvest by holding the plant with one hand and pulling the beans off with the other hand. Pick beans often to encourage the plant to produce more. Different types of peas are harvested at different times. Snow peas are best harvested when the pods are almost flat inside. Sugar snap peas are best harvested when the peas are well formed but are still small inside the edible pod. Harvest shelling peas when the pods are round and bright green and shiny. Once those pods become dull, the peas inside get more fibrous and less sweet. Once the silks begin to turn brown, check your corn every day. Look for plump and full ears. When you puncture a kernel, the juice should be milky. Clear juice means corn is not quite ready. Corn quickly loses its sweet flavor after being harvested. It's hard to keep up with okra once production begins. Once the okra flowers, it will be ready for harvest in 3 to 4 days. The taste of okra pods is best when they're harvested at 2 to 3 inches long. Once the pods are longer than 4 inches, they begin to be fibrous and inedible. The wonderful thing about peppers is they can be harvested at any stage of development depending on your taste buds. Peppers left to mature on the vine will normally turn from green to yellow to orange and then red. As the color changes, the flavor and vitamins increase as well. Picking peppers often will encourage production. If you leave peppers on the plant too long, they will become soft and shriveled looking. Beets are ready to harvest when you can see the top of that beet forming above the ground. So you can pick beets at any time. You can pick them when they're small all the way till when they get much larger. But know that beets are the most tender and flavorful when they are picked small, about golf ball size. Sweet potatoes. The longer you can leave your crop in the ground, the larger the sweet potatoes will become. You can begin checking 90 to 120 days after planting. Dig down a little bit, and when tubers are at least 3 inches in diameter, you can harvest. Harvest before the first fall frost, if possible, or shortly afterwards. When sweet potato leaves and vines begin turning yellow, that means production is slowing down. Leave them in the ground a little bit longer for the largest tubers. If you're growing potatoes, the plant above ground will tell you when the potato below the ground is ready to harvest. Wait until the tops begin to turn yellow and die back, and then dig down and see how large the potatoes are. To increase the storage time of potatoes, allow them to stay in the ground for an extra 2 weeks following the dieback of plants. New potatoes can be harvested sooner, but their storage life isn't as long. When's the best time to harvest Roselle hibiscus? I like to harvest my Roselle when the calyxes are about an inch across, when the calyx is fully formed, but before it begins to separate over that seed pod. That's usually 7 to 10 days after it blooms. Sometimes the spent bloom is still inside that calyx. Pull that out and your Roselle calyxes will last longer before they go bad. Keep your Roselle harvested to encourage more production along those branches. When is the perfect time to harvest artichokes? Harvest artichokes when they are still tight and firm and around 3 inches in diameter. To harvest, cut the stem 2 to 3 inches below the bud with a sharp knife. Store harvested buds in the fridge for up to 2 weeks. Cauliflower can be tricky to grow, and you definitely want to harvest it at the right time. Take a look at that head, and when it's nice and tight, when that head is about 6 inches across and compact, firm, and white, is usually the best time to harvest. If you notice that the head is beginning to separate, harvest right away. It's past its prime a little bit, and the flavor begins to deteriorate. Broccoli. Harvest broccoli heads when they are tight, compact, and blue-greenish, and you always want to harvest broccoli before those yellow flowers appear. One thing I love about growing broccoli is those side shoots. So once you harvest that main head of broccoli, leave the plant in place and side shoots will develop, and you can continue to harvest those side shoots for several weeks. When's the best time to harvest cabbage? You can harvest cabbage anytime once it forms a head. So you can feel that head developing and you can let it get larger, and you want to harvest it before it gets so large that it begins to split. Carrots are one of my favorite things to harvest in the garden. So when do you start harvesting carrots? So harvest a carrot anytime when they're after about 1/2 inch in diameter. So you can dig around a little bit around the carrot to see how wide it is and begin harvesting those carrots and kind of thinning out the carrots by harvesting them. Carrots get sweeter as they grow, but in hot climates, carrots also lose their flavor and get bitter once it gets hot outside. So if you're growing spring carrots, be sure and harvest them before the heat of summer. If you know what to look for, cantaloupe will tell you when it's ready to be picked. Once you pick cantaloupe, it will continue to soften, but it won't get any sweeter. So it's best to leave it on the vine as long as possible. When cantaloupe is ready to harvest, the rind turns from green or gray to yellow. The netting becomes rough. The stem easily separates from the melon. If you have to tug to get it to come off, it's not quite ready. Ripe cantaloupe will have a musky, sweet aroma, and the tendrils around the fruit will dry out and turn brown. Unfortunately, it's not always as easy to tell when a watermelon is ripe, but there are a few things to look for. The 3 tendrils along the stem going back to the root are brown, hard, and curled. The underside of the watermelon turns creamy yellow or white. Ripe watermelon will have a low-pitched thump when you hit it lightly. Practice thumping unripe melons to hear the difference. And finally, the sheen of the watermelon will change from slick to slightly dull looking. Swiss chard can be harvested at any time. So I like to harvest the outer leaves using the cut and come again method. So that means my plant just gets larger and larger and I just keep harvesting those outer leaves. Cilantro is one of our favorite things from the garden. So you can begin harvesting cilantro when it is about 6 inches tall. Just keep harvesting those leaves, and once it begins to flower and bolt, then it's going to form coriander. Harvest cucumbers when they are still firm and that skin is bright, and usually when that blossom is still attached. I like to harvest my cucumbers on the smaller side so that those seeds haven't developed inside and they have the best flavor. How do you know when eggplant is ready to harvest? So this will vary a little bit depending on the variety, but typically eggplant is ready to harvest when it is glossy and firm with only a slight give when you press it with your thumb. And when you pick it on the smaller side, it usually tastes better. Garlic is one of the easiest crops to grow in the garden. Garlic is ready to pick when about half of the garlic leaves have turned yellow and about half are green. At that point, you're going to dig down and harvest the garlic. When it's about harvest time for onions, the tops of the onions are going to flop down. Once those leaves fall down, wait about 10 days and then harvest your onions. Summer squash grows quickly. What is small one day is often ready to harvest the next day. Summer squash tastes best when it's small and tender, usually between 4 and 6 inches long. If you leave squash on the plant longer, the skin becomes tougher and the seeds get larger. Winter squash is ready to harvest when the skin of the squash can't be dented with a fingernail and when the stems shrivel and begin to die. If you live in an area with frost, harvest your winter squash before the first hard frost. If there's a light frost, harvest all the fruit right away. What about lettuce? If you're growing a head variety, it's similar to cabbage in that you want it to develop that head, and then you can go ahead and harvest. If you're growing the leaf varieties, harvest lettuce using the cut and come again method by cutting leaves along the outside, and you will have a continual harvest. I harvest kale the same way. I use the cut and come again method and harvest the outer leaves of kale all season long. All those wonderful perennial herbs that we have growing in the garden, like sage and thyme and rosemary, can begin harvesting once that plant is established. Once you see that it has settled in and is pushing out new growth, you can go ahead and start harvesting small amounts from those herbs. To harvest chives, cut them off at ground level. As a general rule, don't take more than 1/3 of the plant at a time when you're harvesting perennial herbs. Learn when to harvest and enjoy the fruits of your labor.